right, be seated, folks. Thank you. All right, over the night, anybody watch TV, read newspapers, magazines? Did anybody have any conversations with anybody about the issues in this case or any other issue? All right, let's proceed. We're on direct examination.
Dr. Appleton, the first thing I'd like to ask you about this morning is a substance that's been referred to in some documents in this case known as chemisol. Are you familiar with what that substance is?
I've seen reference to it.
Okay. What is chemisol and how did you become familiar with it?
Well, from the documents I've seen, its exact identity was not disclosed, but chemisol seems to be a trade name for an ingredient which was being promoted by its manufacturer in a way such that it was being claimed that if it were added to cigarettes, it would have certain beneficial effects. Those beneficial effects were that it would reduce or eliminate a particular constituent in smoke, namely benzoylpyrene, and then because of that would reduce biological activity in cigarettes as measured by the mouse skin painting tumor test.
Do you know whether or not those claims as to the effects of chemisol were ever tested and what the results are?
Yes, I've seen reports of tests that were conducted in contract laboratories testing the two claims. And from the data that I reviewed, it appeared that the addition of chemisol did not have any influence at all on benzoylpyrene
Well, Your
levels
Honor,
in
unless
cigarettes.
there's some identification, made of the article, the author, the kind of investigation.
Yeah, we're going to run into a lot of problems if this goes this way. Let's have a sidebar conference for a minute.
Picking up again, Dr. Appleton, what do you know about whether or not the claims made for the benefits of chemisol were or were not borne out?
Well, my understanding about this issue comes from laboratory test reports that I've seen, and as I indicated, they looked at two things. One was whether or not addition of chemisol to cigarettes influenced the levels of a particular constituent, namely benzoylpyrene, and from the results that I saw, it didn't have any effect whatsoever. The other effect that was tested was whether or not addition of chemisol influenced the biological activity of cigarettes as measured in the mouse skin painting test. And in this report that I saw, there was absolutely no effect whatsoever. So it appeared that chemisol did not do what its apparent claims were. It did not achieve those results.
Do you have any knowledge as to whether chemisol was in fact ever used as an additive?
To my knowledge, it was never used as an additive.
And the reason why it wasn't used was what?
Well, apparently it wasn't effective at doing what its technical objectives were.
Okay. Now let me pass on over to another subject, Dr. Appleton. Did I ask you to review documents and materials in Brown Williamson's files and materials that were kept in the ordinary course of business in order to familiarize yourself with some research, some technical scientific research known as the Hippo-Battelle research?
Well, I had reviewed that research quite some time ago, prior to this proceeding, but I've also re-reviewed it since then.
Okay, would you, when was the Hippo-Battelle research undertaken? What time period?
Was it conducted?
Yes.
My recollection is it began around 1963 and proceeded for, it may have been 1962, 1963, somewhere in that time frame.
And what was the nature of the Hippo-Battelle research, and why was it being conducted?
Well, it appears that, from my reading, Sir Charles Ellis, who's a prominent and high-ranking scientist within VATCO, expressed a view on a number of occasions that he believed that cigarettes, and nicotine in particular, had beneficial effects. And it was his aim, apparently, to demonstrate or at least test whether or not these beneficial effects could be observed in various animal studies. And so Hippo was a series of animal studies aimed at uncovering, determining, or demonstrating beneficial effects.
Now, what was the research?
The research itself focused on several areas. Hippo 1 focused on measuring various physiological effects, such as the effects of nicotine on body weight, the effects of nicotine on urine production, the amount of urine that rats produced. It looked at several things like the amount of fatty acids in the blood, various fats in the blood. It looked at things like weight of certain organs, like the testes of the rats. It looked at things like cell cycle during the estrus cycle of female rats by looking at vaginal cell smears. It looked at things like the levels of ascorbic acid in the adrenal gland of rats, things along that line.
Was there also research done that was under the name Hippo 2?
Yes, there was.
What was that?
Hippo 2 focused primarily on trying to determine whether or not nicotine acted in a way similar to a drug that was then apparently very popular called reserpine, which was a tranquilizer. And so the focus of Hippo 2 was trying to compare the two to see if they operated in a similar way or in a different way.
Now, was there also any work done to determine how nicotine was absorbed or otherwise went through the body?
Yes, there was. There was another report, the fourth report, which focused on what it was called as the fate of nicotine in the body, and what it measured was how much nicotine gets absorbed when one smokes, where the nicotine goes in the body, where it's distributed, how the body gets rid of it, how it's eliminated, what are the breakdown products of nicotine, what the body converts it to, and how that's excreted. So it focused primarily on what in toxicology what we call pharmacokinetics.
Dr. Appleton, did any of this Hippo-Battelle research establish from a scientific standpoint, or from any standpoint, that nicotine was or was not addictive?
In my view, it wasn't even related to the phenomenon of addiction. When I look at the tests that were being conducted, these are not tests, things like urine production or body weight. These are not tests that a scientist in the substance abuse area would normally perform in order to test the abuse liability of a drug. So in my view, they weren't related, nor did they demonstrate that nicotine was addictive.
This particular research was performed by an organization by the name of Battelle. What was Battelle?
Battelle is a contract laboratory that performs biomedical research on a contract basis.
Let me ask you, Doctor, do you know whether or not the Hippo-Battelle research was actually published?
No, to my knowledge, it was not published.
Do you know the reasons why it was not published?
I believe so.
What were the reasons?
Well, from the record that I reviewed, BATCO
Well,
and
I'd like to know what record he reviewed so that he's going to reach a conclusion
Yeah,
as to
interesting.
why it was not published.
Okay, fine, we'll do that. Let me show you a document marked for identification. I've got some material that you guys council has. It's marked as Defendant Exhibit 14538N. is this document one of the ones you reviewed?
Yes?
Does this document reflect whether or not the Hippo Patel research was submitted for scientific review?
Yes, this document is a
I'm
letter.
going to object to this document.
Okay, let's talk about it.
Okay, Dr. Appleton, you know, with respect to Defendant's Exhibit D14538, I'm going to just direct your attention solely and only to the second paragraph and the second sentence in that paragraph. And without reading it or anything else, let me just ask you, does it reflect the submission of the Hippo-Battelle research to outside scientists for review and evaluation?
Yes, it does.
Now, let me ask you, Dr. Appleton, do you know whether or not such a review and evaluation of the Hippo-Battelle research was in fact conducted?
Yes, it was.
And who conducted it?
Yeah, I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Who was it? Who did the work?
It was done by scientists who were working in connection with the Tobacco Research Council. One was named Armitage, another was named Burns.
Okay. Were these actual outside legitimate scientists?
Yes.
And what did the evaluation of the Hippo-Battelle research show?
According to the scientific review conducted by Armitage and Byrne, they felt that the research was of basically poor scientific quality. They felt that there were many inadequacies in the methods used, the interpretations reached, and their overall conclusion is that it was not publishable in any form whatsoever. So they basically gave it a bad review.
Was that based on the quality of the actual science done as opposed to any particular findings that they made, whether pro or con as far as nicotine or tobacco industry was concerned?
Well, yes, it was based on a range of things. It was based on the quality of the science, the methods that they used, how they constructed the tests themselves, their interpretation of the findings. They felt that they didn't agree with their interpretations in some cases. It was a whole range of things. They had a lot of problems with it.
Now, Dr. Appleton, let me refer you to a document that's in the group of documents that you have there. But it's Plaintiff's Exhibit 943, which has been admitted in evidence. It's a cable of July 3, 1963.
Yes.
Mr. McCormick, Mr. Yeaman. And let me refer you to the second sentence there, which states, TRC consultant scientists advise it is too early to submit Battelle reports to Surgeon General's committee, but we think they will agree that continuation by Battelle of this work would be useful.
Yes.
Now, TRC consultant scientists, who were they?
That was Armitage and Byrne.
And the advice that it is too early to submit Battelle reports to Surgeon General, what was that based on, to your knowledge?
It was based on their assessment of the scientific reports and their conclusion that it was of poor quality and not publishable in any form.
Yes, sir. Now let me refer you now to, I believe, what's the next document in sequence. Plaintiff's Exhibit 944.
Excuse me, these are documents?
Yes, they're in the document you have. 944 right there. It's your document. 944.
Did you use the word for that? Okay, it's in this part.
Yeah, okay. Okay, Plaintiff's Exhibit 944. This is a cable from a Yeaman to a McCormick. Now, Mr. Yeaman was who?
At the time, he was the chief counsel of Brown Williamson.
In the United States, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and he's sending a cable to a Mr. McCormick, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, the date's July 3, 1963, is that correct?
Yes.
Does this particular cable reflect that the Battelle research would not be submitted to the Surgeon General?
Yes, it's what it says, is that it's not advisable to forward these reports to the Surgeon General.
do you know whether or not these HIPAA reports were actually sent to the Surgeon General or not in 1963?
My understanding is that they were not.
And what is your understanding of what the reasons of why they were not submitted?
Well, from my review, it appears that Brown Williamson and Batco always wanted and intended to send these reports to the Surgeon General, but only if they withstood scientific scrutiny by external scientists. They did send them to scientists for review, and the scientists conducted their review and concluded they were basically bad quality research. So based on that conclusion, it was felt undesirable to submit bad quality research to the Surgeon General.
Okay, let me refer you to another document that's in evidence. Defendant's Exhibit 14-521.
14.5.
This is a letter from a Robert Hockett to Peter Hamill. Is that correct?
Hamill, yes.
And let me refer you to the first paragraph, which states, quote, "Some time ago when you and Mr. Roos, I think it is, were in New York, you indicated that you would like to have some material on the possible beneficial effects of tobacco." See that?
Yes.
And did, in fact, Dr. Hockett, the Associate Scientific Director of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, submit references to Dr. Hamill?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Hamill was, what was Dr. Hamill? What was Dr. Hamill's
Can I
position?
see Counsel Sniper a minute?
Sure. Dr. Appleton, drawing your attention now back to Defendant's Exhibit 14-521, the Hockett letter of March 7, 1963.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the scientific references referred to in that letter as attached.
Yes.
Let me direct your attention to the scientific reference, item number 9.
Yes.
It is increased adrenal medullary function. The reference is Larson et al. 1961. You see that, sir?
Yes.
Okay. Did that reference contain information, scientific information, of the same nature as the Hippo-Patel research was investigating?
Yes, it did.
Let me ask you to look at Defendant's Exhibit 14-518, which is an article.
Which one is that, sir? 14 what?
14-518. It's this article, Action of Nicotine in Tobacco Smoking on the Adrenal Medulla. You have it?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that article the reference number 9 that you see in the pocket letter, Defendant's Exhibit 14-521?
Well, I believe so. It refers to, let me look at it again. Yes, it appears to be.
And let me ask you to direct your attention down to the reference at the bottom of that page. Who supported that research?
The research, or the review article
Yes, sir.
by Silvetti and Larson.
Yes,
It
sir.
appears that it was supported in part by, no, it was supported in its entirety by a grant from the Tobacco Industry Research Committee.
And was this article published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal?
Yes.
Let me also direct your attention, please, to Defendant's Exhibit D 14-538 AA. Now that document is a chapter from a book called Tobacco, Experimental Clinical Studies. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, without going into specifically what is contained in the article, does it reflect whether or not scientific information of the same nature as was contained in the Hippo-Patel research was already publicly published in the scientific literature?
Yes.
Objection. I mean, that is just so all-encompassing.
Well, let me just see which, I'm not sure which document you're making reference to.
This one right
The one
here.
that's in your right hand. What's the number on the
The
bottom?
number is 14-538 AA.
Okay, that's this one here. All right.
It's a book. It's a chapter from a book.
Okay.
What is the title of the chapter from the book?
It's Absorption and Fate
Absorption and fate. What is the deal with absorption and fate of what?
of nicotine.
Okay. Does it contain information, scientific information on issues of absorption and fate of nicotine in the body, such as were dealt with in the Hippo-Patel research?
Yes, it does.
Was this published and publicly available scientific literature available to the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee before the 1964 report was issued?
Objection, Judge. I mean, there's no basis of comparison.
Well,
to-
that I think it's a matter for you to bring out in the cross. The questions as to whether or not it's the same article, whether it may deal with the same subject matter, it may have different conclusions, I don't know. These are the things that I don't know just by the questions and by the material. And I think we need to know that.
Well, yes, it's essentially.
Did this deal with the same scientific issues as the Hippo-Patel absorption of fate and nicotine in the body?
Yes,
You
it does.
testified about.
Yes, it does.
Now, Dr. Appleton, taking yourself back to the same time frame, the early 1960s, 1961, 1962, 1963, based on your review of the scientific literature published at the time, was there any clear, specific distinction being made in the literature between the issues of the addictive qualities of smoking and nicotine as opposed to whether or not it was a habit?
Well, based on papers that I've read dealing with this issue in that time frame, it appears that there was not a clear distinction. In fact, what appears was that both the lay people and scientists were using the term interchangeably, namely habit and addiction almost to mean the same thing, or without making any distinction between the two terms.
Well, let me ask you to refer to another document that I have there, Defendant's Exhibit 14538A, another chapter from the Larson and Silvetti book. And what is the title of that chapter?
It's entitled Hypersensitivity and Tolerance, the Tobacco Habit.
Okay. Within this book itself, published in 1961, was there interchangeable use of the terms habit and addiction as it referred to nicotine and smoking?
Yes, there was. And sometimes you'd see the term being used even interchangeably within the same paragraph. It was a very common occurrence that one could see in the scientific literature in that time frame.
Now, let me refer you to Defendant's Exhibit 14538B, which is Smoking and Health, a summary of a report of the Royal College of Physicians of London. It's published in 1962, is that correct?
Yes.
Does that scientific report contain an interchangeable use of the words habit and addiction at that time period?
Yes, it also does. In fact, in one sentence, they even say smoking is an addictive habit. But they also use the term interchangeably, at times suggesting that smoking is a habit, at other times suggesting it's an addiction.
Let me refer you to Defendant's Exhibit 14538C. Now, that's an article from the American Journal of Psychiatry, is that correct?
Yes.
And it was published, I believe it's in volume 119, January 1963, is that correct?
Yes.
What's the title of that article?
Addictive Aspects in Heavy Cigarette Smoking.
And let me refer you on the first page. Can you tell who actually supported, in terms of funding, this particular research?
Well, according to the footnote, it says this work was supported in part by the Tobacco Industry Research Committee.
And who else supported it?
The American Cancer Society.
Okay. Did this particular article look into and do scientific research into the subject matter of the article, that is, the addictive aspects of heavy cigarette smoking in 1963?
Yes, it focused specifically on the issue of whether or not smoking was an addiction or a habit.
Let me refer you to Defendant's Exhibit 14519.
Yes.
This is an article by a Maurice H. Sievers, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in September issue 1962. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what is the subject matter of this scientific article?
The title and subject matter is Medical Perspectives on Habituation and Addiction.
And what is the issue addressed in the article?
Well, Dr. Sievers in this article is presenting what he feels is a problem with the use of terminology with respect to various drugs. What he's laying out is the issue of how both lay people as well as scientists commonly are using the terms habit and addiction interchangeably for a variety of substances, and he also addresses nicotine in this paper and concludes that it's inappropriate to do that, yet the practice is widespread, and expresses concern that these terms are being used interchangeably without any distinction between what difference they may have.
Okay. Now, do you know whether or not Dr. Sievers was on the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee for the 1964 report, the first Surgeon General's report?
Yes, Dr. Sievers was a member of the advisory committee to the Surgeon General for their first report.
Based on your review of the scientific literature of the time, Dr. Appleton, do you have an opinion as to whether or not before the 1964 Surgeon General's committee report was issued in 1964, whether there was any uniform, common usage in the scientific literature of a distinction between nicotine and cigarette smoking as a habit and nicotine and cigarette smoking as an addiction?
There doesn't appear to be. It appears from my review of the literature that this term was used interchangeably, casually, in a casual way, without any distinction between what the two terms may mean.
Okay. Now, I'd like you to, at this time, pick up Plaintiff's Exhibit 910.
910. Okay.
This is admitted in evidence, Plaintiff's Exhibit 910. It's a July 17, 1963 memorandum written by an Addison Yeaman. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is that the Addison Yeaman that you previously referred to as being General Counsel of Brown Williamson, right?
Yes.
He was a lawyer, is that correct?
Correct.
Was he a scientist?
No.
Now, this memorandum is written July 17, 1963. What was the context of the time? What was happening with respect to issues involving smoking and health in July 1963? The context within which this memorandum was written.
General issues or pertaining to use of the term addiction or?
Pertaining to, was the Surgeon General's committee?
Yes, the Surgeon General's committee was doing their work, and it was anticipated that they would soon release a report in the 1964 timeframe.
And this memorandum was written before the Surgeon General's report in 1964 was actually issued. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in this memorandum, does Mr. Yeaman make certain suggestions of his as to what actions could or should be taken in response to that report when and if it were issued?
Yes.
Now, in that context, let me direct your attention to page 4.
Excuse me, counsel. I just located the document. Is this 910?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Your Honor, let me make clear that what we feel in you is, and have given the plaintiff's counsel, is a good copy of 910 so it can be read. The copy is in the record.
Okay. Well, we can substitute
Sure.
a readable copy.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, directing your attention to page 4, Dr. Appleton. Mr. Yeaman quotes in part from the Battelle report. Is that correct?
Yes.
Putting this memorandum in context, what is your understanding of why the Battelle report was even relevant to this particular memorandum that has been in Plaintiff's Exhibit 910?
Well, Mr. Yeaman is anticipating the release of the Surgeon General's report, and in this memo he expresses various views about what he feels that report is going to say, which is basically that smoking is hazardous to health. He also expresses the view that he thinks that, in fact, nicotine has beneficial effects, and that it may be information that's also helpful in the overall context of what the Surgeon General's report is going to say. My reading is that he's saying, well, the Surgeon General's report is going to say cigarette smoking is harmful to health. However, cigarette smoking has beneficial effects, and nicotine has beneficial effects.
Now, in that context, Mr. Yeaman, after quoting the Patel report, has this line: moreover, nicotine is addictive. We are then in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug, effective in the release of stress mechanisms. You see that?
Yes.
What is this issue of being effective in the release of stress mechanism?
That was the hypotheses that the Patel scientists were testing in the hippos. Among the hypotheses that they were testing in the hippo studies was that nicotine may somehow release stress. And among the conclusions that they made in their report was that, in fact, nicotine is effective in releasing stress.
And was that considered to be potentially a beneficial effect?
Yes.
Dr. Appleton, based on your review of the scientific literature of the time and the context within which this memorandum, Plaintiff's Exhibit 910, was written at the time, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the words addiction in this memorandum were meant to distinguish between addiction and habit?
Objection.
Sustained.
Okay. Dr. Appleton, is the issue of whether or not cigarettes are addictive an issue that has been only recently controversial and researched?
No.
How long has that research and controversy been going on based on what you could find from the literature?
Well, at least since the early 1960s.
And in your position as Director of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at Brown Williamson, are you familiar with what Brown Williamson's position is?
Yes,
on
I am.
whether cigarettes are or are not addictive?
Yes, I'm familiar with the position.
Are you familiar with the decision of the Surgeon General in 1964 as to the distinction between whether cigarettes are addictive or a habit?
Yes, I am.
And what was the decision of the Surgeon General in 1964 as to the distinction between addiction and habit?
Well, in 1964, the Surgeon General devoted an entire chapter to this issue. They examined the issue in a rigorous way and set out specific criteria for assessing whether or not smoking was an addiction or a habit. And based on those criteria and application of those criteria, it was concluded in the 64 Surgeon General's report that smoking is not an addiction, but rather should be regarded as a habit.
And are you aware that at some later time, a later Surgeon General changed the definition and changed the conclusion?
Yes.
And when did that happen?
In 1988.
Now, with respect to Brown and Williamson's position on cigarettes, smoking, nicotine, and addiction, what is the position of Brown and Williamson?
Well, our view is that it is a matter of definition, as we're discussing. If one applies more medically and pharmacologically based criteria, as the Surgeon General did in 1964, smoking would not be regarded as an addiction. However, if one applies criteria that are more subjective and more behaviorally based and psychologically based, then certainly a definition could be constructed broad enough to include smoking as an addiction as well as many other things. But our view is that the real issue isn't semantics or definitions. The real issue is, can people quit if they want to? And we think they can, and millions of people have quit. We also don't think that cigarette smoking is in any way comparable to addiction to heroin or cocaine or alcoholism.
Just a moment, Judge.
Okay.
Let me begin with some of your testimony today. You would agree, would you not, that the series of questions that Mr. Russ asked you today, going through these documents, but the whole purpose of these questions was to have you explain away the Yemen document, which was the last document we were talking about. Isn't that correct? To put it in context and to explain it away and say basically Yemen didn't really mean what he said when he said nicotine is an addictive drug.
That wouldn't be my characterization.
What would be your characterization?
To clarify the context in which the terms addiction and habit were used back then, and frankly used today. People use these terms very casually. They are when they say something like "I'm addicted to potato chips or candy bars," they're not using the term in a rigorous scientific sense. And I don't believe Mr. Yemen was then. Apparently, it was so pervasive that Maurice Sievers felt it was important to write an analysis, an essay on the topic at the time.
Now, Dr. Appleton, you know full well that people do not say seriously that they're addicted to potato chips or candy bars in the same context that a person's addicted to cigarettes. You're giving an example which is basically absurd, aren't you? Making a comparison between potato chips and cigarettes.
What I'm saying is that people use the term and have used the term in a casual way without really making any attempt to distinguish the terms between addiction and habituation, or without making any attempt to apply rigorous scientific criteria. The terms are used relatively loosely and were done particularly in the early 1960s, as indicated by the scientific literature and Maurice Sievers' analysis.
Okay. And you're here, part of the reason you're here, you're going to clarify this for us, the difference between addiction and habituation. And as I've understood your testimony, in October 1997, the position of Brown and Williamson and your position as their scientific director is essentially the same. That nicotine, cigarette smoking, is not truly addictive depending upon the definition you want to use. Is it a habit? Is it addictive? It's still confusing, isn't it? So what are you clarifying for us?
Well, I think the main question is, can people quit smoking? And the answer is obviously yes, and millions of people have quit smoking. The issue obviously is one that requires clarification, because the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee have looked at this issue twice and came to different conclusions.
Is nicotine and cigarette smoking addictive?
Is it addictive?
Yeah.
As I indicated, if you're asking me, can people quit smoking? I believe they can. The statistics show they have in millions of numbers. I don't think that cigarette smoking is comparable to being addicted to heroin or cocaine.
So it's not addictive?
I'm not saying it's not addictive. I'm saying it depends upon what definition you're applying. Certainly you could construct a definition so broad as to include cigarette smoking.
According to your definition and the definition of the tobacco industry, cigarette smoking in October 1997 is not addictive because people can quit. Isn't that the bottom line?
What I'm saying is, if you're asking me if people can quit,
I'm not asking
I
you
believe
if
they
people
can.
I'm not asking you if people can quit. That's your premise. I'm asking you if it's addictive. And you're telling me, I think, no, it's not addictive because people can quit. Isn't that true?
No, what I'm telling you is it depends on which definition you apply to the situation.
Which definition do you apply to the situation? Isn't it true that you apply the definition which says it's not addictive?
I think the most meaningful definition is one comparable to what the 64 Surgeon General's Committee used, which is a more medically based, pharmacologically based definition, because it provides distinction between common things like drinking coffee or eating chocolate and more serious situations like being addicted to heroin. Certainly, if one applies a broad definition, nicotine could be included in that definition, but I don't think it's useful to use a definition that fails to distinguish between very common things and very serious things.
Okay, so I think I'm understanding you. The tobacco industry feels comfortable And I agree with you. In 1964, the Surgeon General of the United States, in the same report that said cigarette smoking causes cancer, concluded that it was not addictive. Correct? And that's what you in the tobacco industry are comfortable with in 1997.
Well, what I've said is that this issue is a definition issue. It depends on which definition one chooses to apply and for what reasons.
Okay.
If one wants a definition that clearly distinguishes between very serious situations that, like drugs like heroin and cocaine, that have very serious psychological and physical and physiological effects, if one tries to quit those drugs, as opposed to if one tries to quit drinking coffee, then the broad definition isn't really useful because it doesn't distinguish between those things.
And the Surgeon General's report that came out 24 years after the 1964 Surgeon General's report, which, as I'm understanding you, redefined addiction and found that cigarette smoking was addictive, you disagree with, and you prefer the framework of the 1964 Surgeon General's report on that subject. Is that correct?
Well, it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. I'm just recognizing that the definition that the Surgeon General used in 1988 was much broader and very different. The criteria weren't as objective. They were based more on behavioral effects and psychological effects as opposed to medical criteria. And in some cases, someone may feel that that's a better way to go. Behaviorists and psychologists tend to do that, whereas medical people and pharmacologists tend to apply more medical and pharmacologically-based definitions. I don't know if it's an issue of right or wrong. I have an opinion about what I think is more useful, and I think a more useful definition is one that distinguishes between very serious medical conditions and more casual use of things like coffee and chocolate and so forth.
So you are much... since 19...
Not that I'm aware of.
Now you say people quit. Absolutely true. There are many smokers who have quit. Some have been able to quit cold turkey for whatever reason without any problem. Just make a decision, I'm quitting, throw away this.
We have a question.
It's called leading up. It's also
Well,
called cross-examination.
I understand that, but there's a difference between a question and a statement or a speech. So let's just boil it down to a question.
You would agree, would you not, that some people, some smokers who make a decision to quit can quit easily, or the common expression is cold turkey, and would you also agree there are some smokers who sincerely want to quit who can't quit, or it's very difficult for them to quit? Or is it easy for everybody?
I think it varies. I think for some people it's relatively easy. For some people it's somewhat hard. For some people it's very difficult.
Okay. Well, according to your definition, assume a smoker is convinced smoking is potentially terrible for his health or her health, wants to quit, tries to quit, is sincerely motivated, just cannot give up them cigarettes. Is that person addicted?
I don't know if I could say they're addicted or not. Certainly they're having difficulty giving up smoking. I think if someone is sufficiently motivated, they can quit if they want to.
So your answer to any smoker who says, you know, I wish I could quit, but I can't, is they are not sufficiently motivated.
That may be among the reasons. I don't believe that because somebody has difficulty giving something up, that in itself is a criteria for addiction. There's a lot of things that I'd like to give up or do less of, but I don't think that means I'm addicted to those things.
How many products are there on the market today, widely advertised through national advertising, whose sole purpose is to assist or enable smokers to quit, such as Nicotrol?
Well, I don't know how many products there are. I'm familiar with the basic categories, such as nicotine gum or dermal patches or nasal spray, but I don't know how many different brands or manufacturers there are. or brand styles.
Would you agree generally with the proposition that the smoker who buys those products to assist him or her in quitting smoking can't do it on their own and they need some help?
Not necessarily. Maybe they can do it on their own. Maybe they just want to make it easier, or get some assistance to make it easier. I'm not sure why they may or may not use those products.
I know you're not sure for each and every one, but don't you assume that the vast majority of people buying those products, they're smokers, number one, and they're buying them to help them quit smoking? Or do you make some other assumption?
Well, I don't believe that was the question you asked me. Certainly they're buying them to help. I think you asked me if they're buying them because they absolutely need that and they couldn't do without them, or something along that line. I forgot.
Try to answer the present question.
Okay.
Let me frame it. Would you not agree, common sense-wise, that the great majority of people, smokers who purchase Nicotrol, the nicotine patch, purchase it to assist them or enable them to quit smoking?
Certainly.
Of course. Did you know Mr. Yeaman?
No.
Now, Mr. Yeaman, do you know one way or the other, in addition to being counsel for Brown and Williamson, did he not also hold some official corporate position within the company?
I'm not sure what you mean. I think he was vice president.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I believe he
Okay.
was.
So your understanding of Yeaman was that he wasn't a general lawyer with general clients. He had one client, Brown and Williamson. That's your understanding, isn't it?
Well, I believe he held an executive position. I don't know what you mean by he had one client and that sort of thing. But
Well, he was a lawyer for Brown and Williamson, and he held an executive position for Brown and
that's my
Williamson.
understanding, yes.
Okay. Now, when Mr. Rusk asked you about Mr. Yeaman's July 17, 1963 memorandum, which is marked strictly private and confidential, and you were asked to explain the context of the times in which this was written in July of 1963. And if you go ahead, find the document. 'Cause shortly I'll ask you about some
All right.
specifics. But right now I'm asking you a more general question. Now, is it fair to say that from the standpoint of the tobacco industry, the context of the times was that President John F. Kennedy had appointed a prestigious committee of scientists and medical doctors to look into issues relating to smoking and health, and the tobacco industry expected that when the Surgeon General's report came out the following year in 1964, it would be very negative to them. And it would be a problem.
Okay, you asked me several questions, some of which I'm familiar with, some of which I'm not as familiar with. I frankly don't know who commissioned the committee and so forth, but from the records that I've seen, there was an anticipation that the report would be negative. It would indicate that smoking had health hazards.
Sure. And the tobacco industry, as any business would, who wants to continue to sell their product and wants to continue to make profits, was trying to...
I think he's trying to. I've told him before to make it short and to the point, so I hope he's going to follow the
I
instructions.
am.
All right, go ahead.
I want to say, where was I? It's all right. You would agree that the tobacco industry, like any business, anticipating a very negative national report from the Surgeon General, was trying to figure out a way to lessen its impact with the American people, correct?
That wouldn't be my characterization. My characterization would be any industry who's selling a product that a prestigious panel of scientists is about to say is a serious hazard would certainly be concerned, as the tobacco industry was, and would certainly be looking at what options they have and what they ought to do to respond to the issue.
You would agree that the tobacco industry in 1963 was concerned about how to keep up and continue their tremendous level of profitability in spite of a negative Surgeon General's report relating to the health of smokers.
I'm not familiar with the level of profitability of the tobacco industry at that time, so I really can't answer your question as the way you're asking it. What I can say is what my previous answer was, which is naturally any industry who has a product on the market that a prestigious panel of scientists is about to say is very dangerous is going to be concerned. And naturally they're going to get together and try to determine what ought to be done, what responses would be appropriate, what the next steps might be.
And the expectations of the tobacco industry were correct, because when the Surgeon General's report came out in 1964, you just used the words very dangerous. Obviously, the thrust of the 1964 Surgeon General's report was that cigarette smoking was very dangerous to health.
Yes.
Okay. Now I want to ask you some specific questions about Mr. Yeaman's strictly private and confidential memorandum. Page 2. At the very top. The TIRC, referring of course to the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, cannot, in my opinion, provide the vehicle for such research. It was conceived as a public relations gesture, and however undefiled the Scientific Advisory Board and its grants may be, it has functioned as a public relations operation. Do you agree with Mr. Yeaman's characterization of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee that it was conceived as a public relations gesture and has functioned as a public relations operation?
No, I wouldn't agree with that characterization. Certainly, in the early days of the TIRC, public relations activities were being conducted within the structure of the organization, and there may very well have been public relations benefit of conducting meritorious research in the area of smoking and health. But that does not mean that, in fact, good quality research was not being done. In fact, it was, and I think the record shows for that, just from the vast number of publications that have been published, which have been sponsored by TIRC research grants.
So you disagree with Mr. Yeaman?
Well, I'm not sure if I agree or disagree because I don't know entirely what he means.
You don't know what he means when he's...
Finish his answer.
You don't know what he means?
Just a minute, both of you. I thought he was finished with his answer.
I did.
No, I wasn't finished with my
He
answer.
just got half a word out.
Well,
What I
didn't know what it means. Now, if you want to explain that, go ahead.
I don't know exactly what he means. I do believe that the TIRC, in fact, did do meritorious research in the various areas and still does in various areas pertaining to smoking and health. Now, obviously, he is expressing the view that it was a public relations vehicle, and certainly public relations activities were conducted within TIRC, but just because that happened does not mean meritorious research was not happening. In fact, it was.
You may very well disagree with Mr. Yeaman's, and that is certainly your right, but obviously you know what he means, because he says very clearly that TIRC was conceived as a public relations operation, and it has functioned as a public relations operation. That's hardly an ambiguous statement, is it?
Honor. The objection I had, counsel earlier must ask a question. What does that mean? Objected and said he can't testify with somebody else being here. Your Honor, sustained the objection.
Are we now having
We
speaking
make the same
objections?
objection.
John?
Apparently,
Counsel-
he's trying to, so let's go sidebar and see where we're going. You want to do what, sir?
Can I go to the bathroom while they're doing that?
Oh, all right. Let's take a recess, short recess, folks. Just wait. For me.
It doesn't take long.
I know, just relax. You go, they go. That spot. Yeah, I need that. Just mark the spot that we're talking about. And if the last one out, we'll close the door. Okay.
Right back.
Read me the actual question.
Question. Certainly that is your right, but obviously you know what he means, because he says very clearly, TIRC was conceived as a public relations operation, and if its function is public relations operation. That's hardly an ambiguous statement, is it?
You're talking about what, Mr. Yeaman?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Not asking you to interpret it.
I'm sorry, not seconded.
Well, in a way you are. You're gonna ask him what Mr. Yeaman means, he wasn't, all right.
No, I'm not asking him what this is. I'm asking, you see, the game that all these witnesses play is they want to redefine the question, and they constantly do that. I'm saying this is a clear statement.
Well, it speaks for itself.
There's no need, exactly. But he's disagreeing. He's disagreeing. He won't give me, no.
Okay, now, the difference then, if what's happening is, if the statement is what you say it is on that document, whatever it says, and he doesn't agree with it, you can ask him why he doesn't agree with it, what his opinion is. Okay. Now, wait a minute. Then, the point being, if you want to now go, what is it that Dr. Yeaman mean? I would sustain the objection on the basis that the document itself speaks for itself.
I didn't ask him.
That's what I thought.
Yeaman says this, do you agree or disagree? And then he starts going into a thing that he doesn't think, he's telling me, well, Yeaman didn't really mean that, because TIRC has done very valid
Did he say
research.
that?
Yes.
He didn't know, sir. He did not.
Or didn't know.
That's a different story.
Well, now, Judge, also, the other thing that's happening here is Mr. Rosenblatt reads the sentence, the first time was parenthetical about however undefiled the grant program, the research of the TIRC. And then when he continues to cross-examination, he leaves that totally out because he doesn't read of it. And only ask him about the
Let's-
public relations issue and the function.
Let's get back to-
Obviously, he's going to disagree. That's the sole activity of the
Let's get back to basics. Do you agree or disagree with Dr. Yeaman's statement? If he disagrees, why?
That's fine.
If he says, I have a different interpretation, then you can ask him what his interpretation is, but as far as what the Yeaman's interpretation is, the document will speak for itself, what he said.
As to the first part, Your Honor, he said, I agree with the rules entirely. We let on point, yes, sir. But he's already asked the first part.
And he has asked. He asked.
In other words,
Whether
he's
he
already
agreed or disagreed.
asked the first part, which he's
If he
done.
wants to
Now
find
he
out
is-
what his opinion is, he can ask that.
Well, he already, that's the point.
If he hasn't already.
He's already done that.
Well, fine, that's no problem. We're not gonna go over, and repeat things, but as far as asking what Dr. Yeaman believes.
You've just given him a degree.
Well, whatever.
He's a lawyer. He's just a lawyer.
Lawyer Yeaman.
What do you mean just a lawyer?
I'm sorry about that.
I tried to take his deposition.
He just, he died. We wouldn't have this problem. We'd have
Excuse me, are we still on? Are we still on?
no.
Just thought I'd ask. All right, we'll be back.
I did
What?
already speak the right one, but
All right, let's bring jury. Who's supposed to be be the person handling it? Marvis? Marva. And what does she say? I mean, I thought it was automatic. It's supposed to just... Oh, well. Did you ask Carmen if she sent the payroll? Yeah. All right, have a seat, folks. Thank you. All right, but I've just been informed by the clerk that you're still having a problem with your checks. I don't know who else to talk to, but I'll check with Carmen. I'll check with Marvis, her name is? Marva in finance to find out what's going on. I have no idea. But I thought it was automatic, that they would just churn this stuff out every week. But we'll check on it. All right, sir.
Thank you, Judge. Before you went with Brown and Williamson, you were with R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company.
Not immediately before, but, excuse me, but one job before.
Okay. What was the time frame you were with Reynolds?
I think around 85 to 89.
Okay, and then the job you had after Reynolds was with a food additive company?
Yes.
Who made flavorings for the tobacco company, or was it unrelated to?
It was primarily for the food industry, but among the customers that it serviced were the tobacco industry.
Okay, and then how long were you with the, what was that, Freeze and Freeze?
Yes.
How long were you with Freeze and Freeze?
About 2 years.
And then you went with Brown and Williamson?
Yes.
In what year?
I think 90, 91. I'm not good with dates.
Okay, I'm not trying to pin you down. You would agree that the majority of your working life after you finished your education has been in the tobacco industry?
Yes.
Okay. Let's go back to the Yeaman confidential memorandum. And I'm still on page 2.
Okay.
The second paragraph, where Mr. Yeaman says, thus, to accept its responsibility, would I suggest, free the industry to take a much more aggressive posture to meet attack. Now, you would agree that in the context of this memorandum, the attack that Mr. Yeaman is talking about is the anticipated attack of the 1964 Surgeon General's report on the tobacco industry.
That's not exactly what I would say. My understanding of what he means by that sentence isn't that he views the Surgeon General's report per se as an attack, but the ramifications that would follow as a result of the conclusions made by the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee, or at least his thought or his belief of what could possibly unfold as a result of the committee's report.
So that public health officials having a document from the Surgeon General and other people that were against smoking would use the Surgeon General's report to attack the industry.
That's what I read into it.
Okay. Now let's go on to his next sentence. It would in particular free the industry to attack the Surgeon General's report itself by pointing out its gaps and omissions, its reliance on statistics, its lack of clinical evidence, etc., etc. Now, you would agree that Mr. Yeaman was precisely correct, that when the 1964 Surgeon General's report came out, the tobacco industry did, in fact, attack it.
I was just a young boy at that time, and I really don't have any firsthand exposure or knowledge of how the tobacco industry responded when the Surgeon General's report came out.
Dr. Appleton, you've been asked by counsel questions about reviewing 1963 documents, 1962 documents. You've been asked to put all of this in context. Are you now saying you were just a kid in '62 and therefore you don't know what was going on?
No,
Or can I assume that you have some historical perspective concerning the tobacco industry?
What I'm saying is I don't know what the industry did at that time when the Surgeon General's report came out. I don't know if they attacked it or if they didn't attack it or exactly how they responded. I think you're asking this question you asked me. Would I agree they attacked it? I don't know if they attacked it.
Based on your experience in the tobacco industry, do you think anyone in the tobacco, any CEO of Reynolds, of Brown Williamson, of Philip Morris, of Lorillard said, hey, that's a great report, we agree with it? You know that didn't happen. You know what happened was they criticized the report, don't you?
I don't know that. I assume they'd be concerned about it and respond in various ways, but I don't know if they criticized it or if they did and what way they did it.
Okay. Don't you know from the standpoint of historical perspective, just as you've criticized the 1986 Surgeon General's report on environmental tobacco smoke, just if you criticized the 1988 Surgeon General's report, which you say redefined addiction, isn't it true that the position of the tobacco industry historically with respect to the Surgeon General's report, every time it comes out and every time it has negative conclusions about smoking or secondhand smoke, the standard response of the tobacco companies is to attack it, criticize it?
I don't know if I could say that. I don't think I've criticized the various things that you indicated I have. I've certainly pointed out issues, discrepancies in information, areas where I believe there's uncertainty about information that ought to be present. But I think that that's natural in the course of scientific endeavor to debate these issues and point out strengths, weaknesses, and so forth.
Well, isn't it in the interest of Brown and Williamson and Reynolds and Philip Morris and Lorillard to keep this debate, as you put it, going on forever? As long as the debate continues, you can keep selling the cigarettes. If everyone accepted the proposition that it's harmful and no one listened to your arguments, it would affect sales of cigarettes, wouldn't it?
I have no idea.
Okay.
If
I want you to
the debate
assume...
affects sales.
I won't... Pardon me?
If as you're characterizing the debate, which I'm not quite sure what debate you mean, affects sales or not, I just don't know.
I want you to assume that there's been testimony in this case from a former Surgeon General of the United States, Milton Richmond, who testified that while he was Surgeon General, the 15-year anniversary report came out, 15 years from the 64 report, and that the day before it came out, the Tobacco Institute called a press conference to knock it, to criticize it, and to preempt it. Is that something that you were aware of or not aware of?
I'm not aware of that.
Does it surprise you?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that a press conference may have been held and maybe comments were made or opinions expressed about the strength or weaknesses of whatever the scientific evidence might be, but I don't know the details of it. I haven't had direct exposure to that.
You will agree, looking at Mr. Yeaman's language in his confidential memo of July 1963, that the word he uses is to attack the Surgeon General's report. The second sentence in the second paragraph, it would in particular free the industry to attack the Surgeon General's report itself by pointing out its gaps and omissions, its reliance on statistics, its lack of clinical evidence, etc., etc. I'm not asking you if you agree, but I'm asking you if Mr. Yeaman uses the word attack the Surgeon General's report.
Yes, he does use that word in a sentence.
And when I ask you Has that not been the consistent response of the tobacco industry to attack every Surgeon General's report? As I've understood your answer is you don't know.
Well, no, I don't know what the industry has done in response to every Surgeon General's report. I assume that they have had responses. I assume they've been asked what their view is. They've expressed their views. Some may be at variance with certain conclusions that have been made, and some people may characterize that as an attack.
Now, putting this in context on the question of nicotine, on the question of cigarettes being addictive, page 4, toward the bottom, and it's just a one-line paragraph. And my question is, you would agree, would you not, that at least in Mr. Yeaman's mind, as he expressed himself in this memo, he clearly states that nicotine is addictive, and he's stating that in 1963, correct?
I'm going to object, Your Honor. For this witness answering the question that I asked about what was meant, he's now asking.
No, he didn't ask him what it was meant. He's just saying, is that what he said?
No, he
The
said-
document speaks for itself. If it's in evidence, it does say what it says. So if what the problem is, if you want to read that statement and then ask a question about it, that's fine.
You agree these are Mr. Yeaman's words, because there was some questioning of you on direct examination where there were quotes from Battelle and from the Hippo research, and I just want to establish that you would agree these are Mr. Yeaman's words. Moreover, nicotine is addictive.
Are you asking me what I think he means?
No,
in the
I'm not
context of the
asking you
historical
what you
situation,
think he means.
Or did you read this correctly into the record?
Listen to my questions. You won't have to keep asking me what I'm asking you.
Okay.
Just listen to my question, please. You would agree that these are Mr. Yeaman's words, that he's not quoting Hippo or Battelle or anyone else when Mr. Yeaman says, moreover, nicotine is addictive.
It appears so.
Okay, fine. The documents that you were questioned about today by Mr. Russ, when did you first look at these documents?
It's hard to say because I've been reviewing internal B&W and BATCO documents for a number of years. Some of them I've looked at 4 or 5 years ago and over a long range of time, and some of them I looked at more recently within the last year.
In terms of record keeping and document keeping at Brown and Williamson, are the BATCO documents equally accessible to you as the Brown and Williamson documents are?
Yes.
Are they kept in the same general area on the premises of Brown and Williamson?
Yes.
Now, look at this document, the letter from Robert Hockett of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee to Dr. Hamill, dated March 7, 1963.
This is Plaintiff's Exhibit D-14521.
Yes.
Okay.
Go to the second page where the title is Possible Beneficial Effects of Tobacco.
Yes.
Isn't the real reason why the Battelle Hippo research was never published anywhere and was never submitted to the Surgeon General because it was actually an embarrassment to the tobacco company to pretend that tobacco was beneficial?
I haven't seen anything that leads me to believe that. The documents I've seen suggest that they wanted to give it to the Surgeon General, but only if it withstood external scientific scrutiny, which it apparently did not.
Well, let me ask you this as of today. Do you claim any beneficial health effects for tobacco that's good for people?
Do I claim it?
Yeah.
No.
And to your knowledge, no one in the industry claims it.
No.
Now then there's this one-page document note for Mr. Cutchins.
That's the title?
Yeah, the title of it is Note for Mr. Cutchins, and the date at the bottom, it's just one page, June 19, 1963. In the right-hand corner, it says D 14538J.
Yes.
Okay, you've got that in front of you?
Yes.
The second paragraph. Todd of TRC is today sending copies to TIRC with a request that they consider whether it would help the U.S. industry for these reports to be passed on to the Surgeon General's committee.
Yes, I see that.
Now, you would agree that from the standpoint of this memo, the matter under consideration is whether the research will be helpful to the tobacco industry. And that's what's going into the decision as to whether to send it or not send it to the Surgeon General. Isn't that what that clearly says?
Well, I think there's a lot of things going in the decision on to send or not to send. It appears that the decision to send was motivated by a demonstration of possible beneficial effects of smoking and nicotine. But there were also considerations of whether or not to send it based on if the science was considered of adequate quality. So there's different reasons for either sending or not sending. The reasons to send appeared to be that it was felt that there may be beneficial effects of smoking and or nicotine.
Now, one of the articles that the council asked you about, Exhibit D 14518, the title of which is Action of Nicotine and Tobacco Smoking on the Adrenal Medulla,
Yes.
supported by a grant from the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. You would agree that a non-scientific person, a smoker who is trying to do some research on whether he or she should continue smoking or whether it's a health hazard, this article is not going to be very helpful. It's too technical.
Well, what typically is done is scientific literature is developed and then reviewed by other people, public health authorities, who then make that information available to the public and express it in terms that would be more terms that are commonly used by members of the public. But certainly this information was available to the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee, who ultimately did release a report that was expressed more in terms of that would be commonly used by the public.
You agree the 1964 Surgeon General's report clearly said that the unanimous conclusion of their scientific board and all their prestigious members was that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer.
Yes.
And the tobacco industry has been fighting that conclusion since 1964, right up until October of 1997. That is not a conclusion that the tobacco industry accepts, because they don't accept causation.
Well, I don't know if I can speak for the tobacco industry.
Well, try to.
Your Honor.
And this is what I'm saying. When I ask you to try to speak,
No, it's a statement.
are you aware of any CEO or any high official of any tobacco company, any high official of the Tobacco Institute or the Council for Tobacco Research who says, yeah, Surgeon General in '64 was right. Cigarette smoking does cause lung cancer. You know no one takes that position in the tobacco industry.
Well, we feel that what the Surgeon General has done is appropriate in that they've assessed, the advisory committee have assessed the evidence from a public health perspective, namely determining whether or not there's sufficient evidence to provide warnings to the public about smoking. We recognize they've based that assessment primarily or extensively in epidemiological evidence, and in that context, from a public health perspective, and assessing the issue from the epidemiological point of view, there's certainly sufficient evidence to provide warnings to the public about the possible hazards of smoking. I don't think that's an inconsistent
It's not what I
position.
asked you. What I'm asking you is a very simple and direct question. Isn't it a fact that today, October 1997, the tobacco industry does not accept the fact that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer because they don't accept cause?
Well, again, I can't speak for the industry. I can tell you what my belief is, or what I can speak for Brown Williamson.
Okay, speak for Brown Williamson.
Well, I was just starting to. We recognize there's a strong body of literature, of epidemiological literature, linking cigarette smoking to various diseases, and that's a very strong association. If one is looking at the issue from the context of a public health perspective, namely, is there sufficient evidence to provide warnings to the public about smoking, and their assessment criteria are based extensively or primarily on epidemiological evidence, then certainly it's appropriate to conclude that there's sufficient evidence to provide those warnings. In that context, we would say smoking causes disease. However, in other circumstances, it may be more appropriate to apply more scientifically rigorous criteria to the issue. When I do that, I find there's sufficient information gaps. And I'm talking about the type of criteria that I discussed yesterday, which were among the criteria proposed by the Surgeon General for evaluating some very specific smoking-related situations.
Are you able, Dr. Appleton, to answer this question, yes or no? And if you're not, fine, I'll go on to something else. As far as Brown and Williamson is concerned, your employer, in October 1997, does cigarette smoking cause lung cancer? Yes or no?
Your Honor, that question asked.
He hasn't really answered that question with either yes or no.
He answered it with an explanation.
Well,
That's
I'm
my
not so
problem.
sure. Overruled.
Well, sir, many things in life are very complex and can't be answered with simple yes or no's, and I don't think I can answer this question
Okay,
with simple
fine.
yes or no.
Fine.
What I would say is, depending upon what assessment criteria are used and what the objectives of the assessment are, depends on where one comes out on the issue. If you're in a position of a public health official trying to determine if there's sufficient evidence to make a warning to the public, and you're using primarily criteria of epidemiology, then absolutely, that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that smoking causes these diseases. On the other hand, if you're using a more rigorous scientific approach, then there's questions, and you'd have to say certainly it may, but we're not absolutely certain.
Are you telling me that Brown and Williamson's position is that from a purely public health standpoint, they accept the fact that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and other diseases?
From a public health perspective and using primarily criteria, or extensively criteria, and based on epidemiological evidence, I would say my view would be that in that context it causes disease.
Okay.
But as I said, in other circumstances it's appropriate to apply more scientifically rigorous criteria, and there's too many questions to have a conclusive conclusion.
And your judgment is that all the Surgeon Generals from 1964 up to date have never sufficiently employed the rigorous scientific criteria that you would accept, which would enable you to accept general causation?
I wouldn't say that. They haven't attempted to. The criteria that they're using are extensively based on epidemiology.
you testified about a review by some group of the Battelle Hippo research, who decided that the research was of poor quality and therefore it wouldn't be published and we would not submit it to the Surgeon General. Does that report exist?
Yes.
You have it?
Yes.
That's in your package there?
Yes.
Okay, let me see it. Now, the title of the document you just handed me is a...
May I give the witness?
Oh, I'll hand it. I'm going to give it to him as soon as I give him the title. Appraisal of reports on Project Hippo 1 and Project Hippo 2.
You give the number.
Let him get it.
On the bottom, it's a number. Thanks.
Right. The exhibits, it's Defendant's Exhibit D-14524.
Of who was the appraisal done by? I'm not, as I looked at that document, I couldn't tell.
The last names of the two scientists involved were Armitage and Byrne. Their initials, along with the data, are on the bottom of the document here.
Are they tobacco industry people?
No. My understanding is that they were independent scientists who were advising the TRC at the time.
You know anything about them, what their qualifications are?
I've seen papers that they've published in the literature concerning the pharmacology of nicotine. So they appear to have been quite involved in this subject matter as part of their ongoing research activity.
Now, counsel asked you some questions about an exhibit D14538C from the American Journal of Psychiatry in January of 1963, which is the official journal of the American Psychiatric Association.
I'm sorry, what was that exhibit number again?
D14538C.
Okay.
Now, to your knowledge, has the American Psychiatric Association accepted the Surgeon General's definition of addiction as set forth in the 1988 Surgeon General's report?
I don't know if they have or have not.
Now, counsel had asked you about an article by a PhD, a Dr. Maurice Sievers, Medical Perspectives on Habituation and Addiction, exhibit number D14519. And I believe he asked you whether Dr. Sievers was on the committee for the first Surgeon General's report, and I believe you said yes.
Yes.
So obviously Dr. Sievers concurred in the unanimous finding in the Surgeon General's report of 1964 that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer?
I would assume he did.
Now, your title at Brown and Williamson is, if I wrote it down correctly, Director of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs?
Yes.
Okay, what's involved with regulatory affairs?
Various matters. One of the main things we look at is concerning the ingredients that we use in the manufacture of cigarettes. Several countries have regulations that govern the use of ingredients specifically used in cigarette products and other tobacco products. The United States has some regulatory reporting requirements concerning those ingredients. So we address those matters. And we also address other matters that may come up from time to time, like initiatives proposed by various international governments about regulation of tobacco ingredients, proposals from the states, various things like the EPA publishing their draft risk assessment. We might respond to that or provide a technical response concerning that, any number of matters.
Do you get involved, for example, with federal agencies such as the FDA or the FTC in your capacity as Director of Regulatory Affairs?
No direct contact with those agencies. We did help provide a response to the proposed notice of rulemaking that the FDA published in the Federal Register, and but no direct activity with the FTC.
Do you know Dr. Townsend?
Yes.
Did you work with him?
A little bit, not extensively, but I knew him. I interacted with him occasionally while I was at R.J. Reynolds.
When you were with the Flavor Company, between your employment with Reynolds and your employment with Brown and Williamson, you also had a position there as manager of regulatory affairs.
Yes.
And was that the same kind of involvement as you've expressed, or was it different?
Similar, but different. It was more documentation intensive. We provided various types of regulatory documentation to our customers, such as ingredient disclosures, material safety data sheets, kosher certifications. We would get advice on labeling from USDA, so we would interact with the USDA and make submissions to them about how different flavor ingredients would be, how they would be labeled on the customer's packaging, that sort of thing.
Now, part of your job with Reynolds was to assist in litigation, to advise and assist.
So, yes, on some occasions, yes.
As, of course, you're doing in the Brown case.
Yes.
Now, you actually, when you were with Reynolds, you received a bonus for the excellence of your work in connection with some particular litigation. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know if it was in connection with particular litigation, but I think in performance of overall technical support to the law department on various matters concerning the issues that were being raised in, I think, more than one litigation proceeding.
And part of your job was to provide technical support both to internal and external lawyers.
Yes.
And you got something called the President's Award?
Yes.
What president are they referring to? The president of Reynolds?
I think so, yeah. I never really was sure.
And part of your job was in helping to prepare witnesses to give testimony? Either
No.
by no? Didn't
No.
involve that at all?
No.
Well, the bonus you got was a performance type bonus for a good performance.
Well, for overall performance, not a specific event.
Does Brown Williamson do the same thing?
We have a program, it's sort of a quality improvement type program whereby it's sort of a peer recognition program where there's committees of what's called peer recognition groups, where if someone does something really good, a particular job or sustained performance on a project or something, they could be nominated for recognition to receive an award by their peers. It'll go through a sort of a bureaucratic process and ultimately could culminate in them receiving an award. Yeah, so they have a similar type program.
I mean, if things turn out well in litigation, you're more likely to get a performance award than if things turn out badly. Isn't that correct?
Sustain the objection.
What was your role with respect to the Premier cigarette?
I had a relatively minor role. In the beginning of the project, I was involved in assessing health-related matters and regulatory-related matters pertaining to some of the ingredients that were being looked at and evaluated, which might possibly be used in the product.
And as far as you were concerned, all the ingredients passed the health test. None of them were hazardous.
Well, based on our review of the literature, there is no reason to conclude that as used, they would result in a significant health hazard, nor was there any indication that they would not be legal in the proposed countries of marketing.
Now, you would agree that the Premier cigarette had virtually no side stream smoke, and that was really one of the purposes why it was developed.
Well, there are many purposes, but I would certainly agree that it had substantially reduced side stream smoke.
Well, what was another significant purpose of the Premier cigarette other than to meet the concerns of those people who felt that secondhand smoke was a health danger?